The former and future president is moving quickly to fill the clown car and round out his cabinet before he changes his mind and fires them all. Moments ago, Trump announced that he has selected Fox Weekend morning show host, you can't make this up, Pete Hegseth, to serve as Secretary of Defense, because why not? Trump has also reportedly landed on Florida Senator Marco Rubio as his Secretary of State, which will make him, Rubio, the first Latino to serve as America's first diplomat. Choosing a Latino neocon war hawk after running a racist isolationist campaign raises, questions. Rubio was a loyal surrogate for Trump during the campaign, even after being passed over for vice president and after being a punching bag for Trump during the 2016 campaign.
I watched this lightweight Rubio, total lightweight, and little mouth on him. Bing, 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 bing.
When they put Marco on to refute President Obama's speech, do you remember that catastrophe? And he's like this, and we were, I need water, help me, I need water, help.
Oh, the world is looking at us like we're absolutely insane. I'm just saying that. Okay, but let's just dispel with this fiction that Donald Trump doesn't know what he's doing. Even there, he knows exactly what he's doing. And he's placing sycophancy and bending the knee as the most important prerequisites for jobs in his administration. It's really the only way that you can explain Trump choosing someone whose positions about you are as fickle as this.
I don't understand why his hands are the size of someone who's 5'2". Have you seen his hands? They're like this. And you know what they say about men with small hands? I will never stop until we keep a con man from taking over the party of Reagan and the conservative movement. It is time to open our eyes. We cannot allow a con artist to get access to the nuclear codes of the United States of America. With Donald Trump back in the White House, together we will dream big again for this country. We will be a country that once again is proud of its history, excited about its future.
So sorry. Oh, God. Joining me now is David Jolly, who served in the House of Representatives as a Republican, but for some reason we can never figure out that we've been trying for years is no longer affiliated. No longer affiliated with them. I'm sorry.
You just saw why. One of the main reasons. You just saw why.
I'm so embarrassed. The whole world can see us, David. They can see us. They can see us. They see us. They're like, what is...
They all fall in line. They all fall in line, Joy. Eventually, they all fall in line.
Where is the dignity? How? Okay, in all seriousness, I'm sorry. I had a little laughing fit, and I apologize. I get laughing fits, and I can't stop. How does Rubio look going around the world when he's going, let's say, to Venezuela, and Trump is making a guy who's very hardcore on Venezuela, anti-Maduro, take the knee to Maduro, take the knee to Putin? That's the job. He's taken a job where he's just going to be humiliated. How long before he gets fired?
I know, Joy. Ted Cruz should be thanking Marco Rubio because it shifts the spotlight to his bending of the knees this evening. Look, I think the telling sign was actually April of this year, I believe, when months after Ukraine needed that final aid package, or at least the latest aid package, Ukraine was begging for it, Democrats were begging for it, many Republicans were begging for it. Marco Rubio flipped on his previous position of being hawkish on Russia and actually voted against aid to Ukraine, waved the white flag, and basically said, I'm going to go along with President Trump's idea of just ceding territory to Vladimir Putin. The reason that's interesting is that was just before the Veep stakes started up and people were talking about Marco Rubio. So he clearly was falling in line for his own place of power and prominence. And then when he didn't get the Veep stakes, I guess this is the consolation prize. But to your point, I'm not sure the Secretary of State under Donald Trump has any power anyway. Donald Trump's going to run foreign policy on his Twitter account, and that's going to be the end of it. And then Rubio's going to have to back it up in front of the press, I suppose.
And just humiliate. And look, are we surprised? His staff basically wrote the immigration reform bill during the Obama administration, and he voted against his own bill and turned on it because Rush Limbaugh yelled at him one time. So it's not, there's the old saying that you and I both know in Florida: if you're depending on Marco Rubio to save you, you're already dead. Let's go to the other cast of characters. It's like he's casting a ratchet TV show on Tubi. You've got Michael Waltz, his pick to be National Security Advisor. He advised Dick Cheney, Dick Cheney on counterterrorism. He went after Liz Cheney and said, and sort of fantasized about her being shot in the face, and then hired Dick Cheney's advisor to be his national security guy. Let's keep going. Mike Huckabee. Oh, that's fun. Huckabee's back. He's going to be the ambassador to Israel. His quote, he says, negotiating for the Palestinians is like trying to negotiate with the Nazis in World War II. You just don't. You beat them. You defeat them. You eradicate them. A lot of people voted for Trump because they were mad about Biden's foreign policy in Israel. Well, that's what it is now. We've also got Kristi Noem. Kristi Noem, can we watch her dance? And she was dancing next to Trump when he did his weird, just sort of swaying for 45 minutes, and she danced with him, and that was her audition.
It's called white church dancing. It's called white church dancing.
White church.
I know about it. I know about it.
What is happening? Is he casting for a TV show or a presidency?
Well, if you do, compare this to 16, right, when there were some people that came in from outside of MAGA world, however it was in its infancy, and they were going to be normal Republicans or normalized Trump. That's not this go-round. In fact, he's bringing in the likes of Pete Hegseth from Fox News to be Secretary of Defense. And look, Hegseth himself has 20 years as a National Guardsman. Good for him. He also represented the Koch brothers to try to help privatize the VA. So he's bringing in these super conservatives. And I think it's the loyalty test first, conservatism second.
And let's talk about what Donald, this is even the scariest, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Great, we're going to get to hear his voice again for however many years till he gets fired. They're going to lead something called the Department of Government Efficiency. They're supposed to now be in charge of cutting the budget, which is normally the job of the House of Representatives. You served in the House. Doesn't the House have to be involved some way in creating a new government agency, or can Trump just whip one up on Twitter?
No, Joy, that's right. I think Donald Trump's just handing out candy right now to his friends and family. Congress is required to establish federal departments to define the jurisdiction, to decide how it's appointed. Presidents can certainly appoint aides and non-congressional positions, but there will not be a Department of Government Efficiency without Congress, which actually raises the question, does Congress now just rubber stamp that in one of its next appropriations bill? And here's what it's going to be. This is your Project 2025 department.
Yes.
The Department of Government Efficiency by Ramaswamy and Elon, that's your Project 2025 department. Without the bad impressions that Heritage created during the campaign trail.
Right. And I mean, the sort of irony is people are now mass Googling Project 2025 because now they want to know what it is. It's like, nah, man, Project 2025 is what your government is going to be. There are a few other people that we know are going to probably be there. I believe one of his lawyers, Alina Habba, might be his spokesperson. So essentially, it's everyone who did him a solid and danced for him, or as you say, white church danced for him, or danced around in a bedazzled jacket for him at the place where Puerto Rico was called a trash heap. That's how you get a job with Trump. Do you think any of these people last a year?
I guess it's all a loyalty test, but probably not. We'll see some high-profile firings. I think all this culminates in Donald Trump setting up his own media platform, pushing Fox News, Newsmax, and OAN out of the way. And all these cast of characters that you will see with government responsibility now will have their television shows after in a Trump media platform, which should concern all of us, is whether or not the first priority of these appointments is actually somebody that can govern. I will say with Rubio, he's qualified. People can probably disagree with him. He's actually one of the more qualified picks. Kristi Noem maybe as an executive, but hopefully there's no dogs around the office at DHS. But this gets real quick when you start going down the trail here.
Well, first of all, Trump hates dogs, so he won't have a dog. So then I guess that the White House is safe for pets, because Trump, it was Trump. He claimed the Haitians are eating pets. Kristi Noem shoots the pets, and that's actually true. That's like not even slagging her. It's real.
The first investigation of the new DHS secretary will be in Springfield, Ohio. But we can probably count on that. Site visit.
Lord help, the world can see us. David Jolly, thank you.
Joining us now, NBC News correspondent Garrett Haake, NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Dilanian, and the Washington Post senior national political correspondent and MSNBC political analyst Ashley Parker. All right, so Garrett, I'm going to begin with you. The order of these choices strikes me. Can we say that these three things will be his top priorities for his administration? We're talking about deportations, deregulation, and hardline positions on Iran and China.
Yeah, look, I think these choices very much point in that direction, Katie, particularly the sort of national security positions, Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, and also Tom Homan coming back in this border czar role. Well, he will essentially report directly to Donald Trump. These are priorities that Trump laid out on the trail, and I think they wanted to make very clear from the outset that they're priorities they're going to follow through on. Beyond that, I frankly wouldn't read too much into the order itself. To borrow a phrase from Nancy Pelosi, in these situations, sometimes there are guys who need jobs and jobs that need guys. And in the case of someone like Lee Zeldin or Elise Stefanik, these were people who were very loyal to Trump for a long time, who needed to be found positions within this administration. I don't know that it was necessarily that they needed to announce these things right away to send a specific message.
You don't think that announcing the very first big announcement, Garrett, just to push back a little, on it, the border czar was meant to send a signal that mass deportations?
I think the border czar was meant to send a signal. That's why I separate that out from Stefanik and Zeldin, who I think are more in the category of people who've been specifically loyal to Trump over time. I think the border czar part of it is absolutely meant to send a message. I mean, Trump has talked about this as a day one priority. He said he doesn't need Congress. He thinks he can do it by executive order, essentially by fiat. And he's putting someone at his right hand who he believes can help him do that.
Garrett, what about Senator Rubio? Interesting, because he's a pick that Democrats are so far signaling that they're okay with, someone they think that they can work with. He's also somebody who's been pretty tough on, at least on messaging toward Russia. Make the case for Marco Rubio as Secretary of State for Donald Trump.
Yeah, look, I mean, Marco Rubio has been a senator for 14 years. He's the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee. He's privy to our nation's most closely guarded secrets in that role. And I think he's seen as a serious player on foreign policy by Democrats and by Republicans alike. You may not like his politics. Democrats may not be happy with his politics. But this, you know, ultimately Donald Trump needs a Secretary of State. And within the foreign policy establishment in Washington, the reasoning has been that Donald Trump, or that Marco Rubio is someone who understands the rules of the game, knows who the players are, and is kind of a serious enough operator that he's not going to go out there and embarrass himself if he has to, you know, move too far in one direction towards Donald Trump to please the boss. And so I think, you know, kind of given the Venn diagram and the overlap in the Venn diagram between the parties and what we agree on are national security priorities, Rubio is a choice that I think will help a lot of folks who didn't vote for Donald Trump sleep better at night about having him at the till.
Ashley, what about Mike Waltz? He's not somebody that's super well known outside of Fox News.
No, but he's somebody who, like a lot of these picks, is incredibly close and loyal to Trump. He's someone we started hearing about as a close Trump ally and saw defending Trump on a lot of his positions throughout the course of this campaign. And he also shares, and again, this is what Trump wants this time, someone who very clearly shares his worldview, tough on China. And Walz shares his worldview. He had a convention speaking spot, I'll also add. He also frequently got confused with Tim Walz. That's neither here nor there. But again, shares his worldview on a number of these important, big policy issues, a vocal defender. And so it's not surprising that someone like that, who kind of checks both boxes, the personal loyalty and acolyte, and also a shared world vision, would emerge as a top person in Trump's administration.
All right, let's talk about immigration a little bit more. Governor Noem, Garrett, she's not necessarily somebody who has a deep well of immigration experience. Why Governor Noem, who's not from a border state, to lead DHS? Are you putting her in line with the Lee Zeldins and the Elise Stefaniks?
Yeah, that feels more like the guys who need jobs than the jobs who need guys category here. I mean, Noem has been a strong supporter of Donald Trump. She's someone who's been an acolyte of his, to borrow from Ashley, and has been out there on the trail for him. I think also with the immigration responsibility apparently largely going to be centralized out of the White House, with Homan and Stephen Miller working on that, it's possible that she could have less of a policy role than other DHS secretaries might. But I'll also note that she has not been formally announced yet by the campaign. And so I'm curious to see what the rationale is once they decide to start defending that choice more publicly.
Is it going to be a problem, Ashley, to defend the choice of Kristi Noem? She was floated for a little while as potentially a VP pick, maybe, but then there was that book, her memoir that came out, where she talked about having to shoot her own dog.
Right. That essentially killed her chances right there. Trump is not a huge fan of dogs, actually, but even he knew that he had a political problem on his hands with that. But to defend that choice, again, just to sort of level set, this is a Senate, for instance, where he has some margin for error. And while she's not necessarily the most conventional choice for the obvious reasons, not a border state, no particular experience in this area, she is someone who has made clear she will do what he wants her to do. And that's important to him in this role. So, again, he is going to be able to push through more of his important priorities, especially with a little wiggle room in a Republican-controlled Senate and likely or potentially a Republican House, although that obviously doesn't matter for the confirmation.
Yeah. What about the CIA and the FBI, Ken? So far, we haven't got any names for those roles, but you're reporting that the FBI is preparing for some big changes.
Yeah, that's right, Katie. Sources tell us that both Chris Wray's team and the Trump team are preparing for the likelihood that Wray will be replaced as FBI director. Whether Trump fires him or just signals that he should leave and then he resigns is unclear. But look, Chris Wray's FBI, let's not forget, served that search warrant on Mar-a-Lago, barged in there and took those documents. So, I mean, no agency has drawn more criticism, savage criticism from Donald Trump over the years than the FBI. Not necessarily Chris Wray in particular. Donald Trump hired him. He's a Republican, although he has criticized him. But there does seem to be a consensus that Trump wants to replace him as FBI director. And, you know, we've heard names that run the gamut from bomb thrower Kash Patel to mainstream Republican Mike Rogers. That's a huge gap. And depending on who gets that job, I think it'll send a big signal about in what direction the Trump administration is going in terms of law enforcement.
Also a big signal to the rank and file of the FBI about how they're going to operate. Let me ask you about the DOJ. What names are being floated for Attorney General? What about this Mark Paletta guy?
Yeah, Mark Paletta has been out there almost campaigning for the job. And the reason that a lot of people inside DOJ are very nervous about him is that he has been articulating the shattering of a 5-decade post-Watergate norm. He's saying that the president should be able to order specific investigations into specific people in the context of Donald Trump saying he's going to investigate and prosecute his enemies. Take a listen to Paletta.
Only in the federal government, only with a deep swamp, do people, you know, career employees think that they get to run the joint, as it were. You know, President Trump, you know, was reelected with an overwhelming majority of an agenda by the American people, popularly supported. So deporting millions of illegal aliens out of this country, securing the border, banning DEI, all that destructive stuff that the Biden administration let run wild. Getting boys out of girls' sports. Those are all the things that the Department of Justice is going to work on. And those are the things that the Department of Justice employees, career employees, are going to support. And if they don't want to support it, they should leave.
And you know, Katie, DOJ public servants are used to working for both Republican and Democratic presidents. They have no problem shifting policy on a dime. What they do have a problem with, though, is being ordered to investigate people without proper predication. If that happens, you will see resignations.
The country's top diplomat, Donald Trump, is turning to a prominent one-time critic turned Uber ally. Sources tell NBC News that Donald Trump is expected to nominate Florida Senator Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. Rubio's relationship with Donald Trump reflects the arc of much of the modern Republican Party in the era of Trump. Just like Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, Rubio had a lot of things to say about Trump in the 2016 election. None of them were very nice.
If he hadn't inherited $200 million, you know where Donald Trump would be right now? Selling watches in Manhattan.
Guys, we have a con artist as the front runner in the Republican Party. A guy who has made a career out of telling people lies.
It is time to open our eyes. We cannot allow a con artist to get access to the nuclear codes of the United States of America.
I mean, it's not America's Hitler and cultural heroin. That was J.D. Vance. But it does appear that all of that is water under the bridge for Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio has evolved, as they say, to meet Trump and the MAGA movement. The New York Times reports this, quote, Rubio was elected to the Senate in 2010 and has staked out a position as a foreign policy hawk, taking hard lines on China, Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba in particular. He initially found himself at odds with those Republicans who were more skeptical about interventions abroad. But he has also echoed Trump more recently on issues like Russia's war against Ukraine, saying that the conflict has reached a stalemate and, quote, needs to be brought to a conclusion. As Secretary of State, Rubio will find himself dealing with an inherent tension between our national interests and Trump's view of the world, in particular, his fondness for and alignment with autocrats like Vladimir Putin. As Mark Mazzetti from the New York Times points out today, the most detailed and damning report about Russian interference in the 2016 election was produced by the Republican majority Senate Intelligence Committee, which was, wait for it, chaired by Marco Rubio. Joining our coverage, John Hudson, national security reporter for The Washington Post. Also joining us, former Republican congressman from Florida, now an MSNBC political analyst, David Jolly. John Heilman's still here. John Hudson, take us inside how Marco Rubio came to land the spot as Secretary of State.
Yeah, well, if confirmed, this is a huge win for the neoconservative wing of the Republican Party, of the more establishment foreign policy wing of the Republican Party. Look, Rubio is a bona fide hawk when it comes to Latin America or Asia or Middle East. He has always staked out some of the most hawkish positions in the party, start in the beginning of his political career. But you've got to remember that the Marco Rubio of today is not the Marco Rubio of 2016. Whether it's economics, or immigration, or foreign policy, he has tried to modulate his views on these conflicts. He's remained a tough hawk on China, which is still popular within both the MAGA and the neoconservative wing of the foreign policy apparatus, but he has modulated on Europe. He used to be one of the toughest critics of Russia and Vladimir Putin. He has begun to criticize the conflict in Ukraine and U.S. spending on it, and he's begun to forecast a view that this needs to wrap up. The Marco Rubio of 2016 would have been somebody that says, as long as it takes, he would have mirrored the language of President Joe Biden. And so that's really what led to the transformation and put him in a place to become the nation's top diplomat under Trump.
David Jolly, let me show you what Adam Kinzinger had to say about the Rubio pick.
Marco Rubio has been obviously kind of changing. I think he even voted against Ukraine aid, which was very surprising. Again, and I'm willing to, give as much leeway as possible. But, Marco has shown his ability to kind of change for whatever Donald Trump demands. So it really comes down to what does Donald Trump demand?
What's amazing is that loyalty is in tension with subverting of past public statements, right? Trump seems to delight, and this seems to be something that's different about the first time around. He seems to delight in having on the ticket someone who he was able to convert from, again, J.D. Vance described Donald Trump as, quote, America's Hitler, quote, cultural heroine. Mitch McConnell described him as a, quote, despicable person. Marco Rubio, quote, a con artist. Trump seems to delight as much in the converted as the totally subservient.
Yeah, and for Marco Rubio, it privately must be a very painful moment. I mean, in 2010, Marco Rubio was the future of the party. He was going to be the next Republican president. He bet it all on comprehensive immigration reform. Imagine that, Republicans actually leading on a pathway to legal status. And he got burned by that. And then he was never quite the same. And he was going to leave the Senate in 2016, said he didn't want to go back. He hated it. The Senate was a terrible place. And then Donald Trump just wrecked his presidential aspirations down the stretch. And you began to see, John used the word modulate. I agree with that. It's a very generous term. He began to cave to Trump and Trumpism in the direction the party wanted to go. And I think the most telling part of all, and kind of heartbreaking for people who have followed the generally hawkish, new Reaganish Marco Rubio of 2010 was his abandonment of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people last April, when he said it is time to come to a close. He was one of 15 Republicans to vote against the aid package. You'll recall how long that was delayed and how dire the circumstances were. The Ukrainian people needed the aid. But consider why and when he did that. It's when he had an idea that he might be in the Veep stakes for Donald Trump. And all of a sudden he found this new position that went counter to his very hawkish position on Russia of the past 10 years or so. I think another intriguing one, I mean, look, in some ways, Marco Rubio is at least very qualified for this role, notwithstanding his caving and flip-flopping and willing to do anything for Trump. He is qualified through his work in the Senate on the intelligence matters. He has been a leader in this area among Republicans. It could be much worse for a Trump pick. Marco Rubio is qualified. But what will be interesting is how he navigates Russia-Ukraine, probably just surrender to Putin, which is what Trump wants to do. What does he do on North Korea? You know, this was also a position where he's been extremely hawkish in a bipartisan way with Tim Kaine. But as we recall, Donald Trump was happy to go play footsie with North Korea. So I think we're about to see Marco Rubio have to cave even a little bit more than he's done in the past 14 years or so.
All right, we'll bring Heilman in on this. We have to seek in a quick break first. And I would tease this. The last two folks to have this job described Trump as a, quote, effing moron. The second, Mike Pompeo, was banished from a second term. So a flurry of appointments in the last 24 hours, bringing Donald Trump's future administration into fuller view. Sources tell NBC News that Trump is expected to tap Florida Senator Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. Rubio once called Donald Trump a, quote, con artist who can't be trusted with the nuclear codes. But over the years, he became one of Trump's biggest boosters. We'll have more on that pick later in the hour. But we begin with another appointment to another high-profile post that reveals the one quality Donald Trump really values in his future administration: loyalty. NBC News reports that South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem is expected to be named Secretary of Homeland Security. The news coming less than 1 month after this incredible moment. We once aired all 39 minutes, but since you've seen that already, you know that that goes on for 39 excruciating minutes. And we thought today maybe it's a reward for that Noem will now head the agency that will be responsible for carrying out one of the incoming Trump administration's key campaign promises, and that is mass deportations of millions of undocumented immigrants here in the United States. Noem will head the department that oversees FEMA, helping Americans recover from natural disasters, the department responsible for the TSA. They protect Americans when they fly. The DHS will be responsible for security for the 2026 World Cup and the 2028 Olympics, both of which will be held in the United States during Donald Trump's second term in office. Now, after going through her resume, the only obvious qualification we found for her appointment today has been her blind loyalty to Donald Trump. But maybe you'll see it differently. Here's the sampling of her record. Noem gained national prominence by refusing to shut down South Dakota during the height of the COVID pandemic, which at one point had the highest per capita death rate, the third highest in the world. Recently, in her memoir, she was caught fabricating meetings with world leaders like North Korea's Kim Jong-un and France's Emmanuel Macron. And she's currently banned right now today by 9 Native American reservations, which account for 20% of the land in her state, for speaking outright lies about drug cartels operating on those reservations. And of course, in her own words, she admitted to shooting her own dog because she couldn't train it properly. News that was so shocking and offensive even inside the MAGA bubble that it appeared to tank her chances of becoming Trump's VP. That's where we start the hour with former Trump White House Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews. With us at the table, NBC News correspondent Jacob Soboroff. He's the executive producer of the film Separated, based on his book of the same name. It is about mass deportations and family separation that took place during the first Trump presidency. Also at the table, political columnist, host of the podcast Impolitic for Puck, MSNBC national affairs analyst John Heilman is back. I start with you and the serious belief among Trump's voters and supporters that this will happen. Just give me a sense of how many people he successfully deported the first time and how much larger the operation will be that Kristi Noem will now be responsible for this time.
Simply put, less than Obama, who deported more people than any president in the history of the United States presidency. And let me back up and say again what we said when we talked last week. Mass deportation is family separation by another name. There are millions of people who live in the interior of this country who have undocumented family members, maybe as many as 20 million. And so what Kristi Noem is going to have to do is make the decision that Kirstjen Nielsen, who comes to mind in this moment, made when she was presented with a stark choice by members of the political operation of the Trump administration, namely Stephen Miller and other people who pushed this policy. Would she sign a memo like Kirstjen Nielsen did? Option 3 was the memo for family separation, to deliberately deport people that are intertwined with the lifeblood of the country, people who are in our schools, in our churches, in our places of work, who are our neighbors, who make the economy go in this country every single day. And most importantly, is she willing to stomach the blowback that this country saw, that the world saw, unilateral, not bipartisan, but sort of universal condemnation, including the Pope, to something that separates families in the interior? And that is exactly what they are proposing. I know they're saying sort of felons, not families. That was the Obama line, actually, back when he deported more people than any other president in history. Are they just going with the Obama plan, or are they going to go further? I'm very curious to hear from this administration about the particulars and the practicalities of this. And now that's on Kristi Noem, who, by the way, I don't know how many people she managed in South Dakota. Maybe it was 10, 15,000 as the governor. The Department of Homeland Security has 260,000 employees. Is she prepared for that? Is she ready for that? That's a question that she's going to have to answer.
Sarah, DHS is a relatively new government agency. It was propped up after 9/11. It does have, though, the highest profile events that happen in this country. And for someone as vain as Donald Trump has proven to be, who might take pride in pulling off an Olympics or a World Cup, what does it signal to you that someone with no, again, we looked at her record, we didn't find any obvious experience with events of that scale really ever happening on her watch? What for you explains this pick?
I think that it all comes down to loyalty. Like you noted, her record, she doesn't have any background in national security or law enforcement that you would typically see to choose someone to head up this agency. And the mission of the Department of Homeland Security is a vital one. It's vast. It covers things like you mentioned, from FEMA to Secret Service falls under DHS. And obviously there's been failures at Secret Service right now. And then the border crisis, something that Donald Trump ran on, that was a key part of his campaign, and why I think you saw people switch to support him in this election. And to imagine that she's going to be in charge of all of those things is a little bit alarming. And I think it's been telling, too, that even MAGA world, there's been some pushback on this selection. I think that not everyone is necessarily thrilled with her selection. She turned off a lot of people, even those within MAGA world, with when she was pushing her memoir and told the story about killing her puppy because she couldn't train it. And so I think it's worth noting that Kristi Noem has killed more animals than any Haitian migrant in Springfield, Ohio ever has. But to imagine that she's going to be in charge of this agency is a little bit alarming. But I think some of Trump's other cabinet selections, even if I think someone like a Marco Rubio is spineless, I think that he's more than qualified to be Secretary of State. Whereas I don't know if people can say the same about Kristi Noem.
John, let me show you some reporting from my colleague Julia Ainsley at NBC News. She writes this: Noem has a close relationship with former Trump campaign manager Corey Lewandowski, and he has given her political advice during her career. One source familiar with the decision to pick Noem as DHS secretary said Lewandowski may join her with a senior position inside DHS, possibly as her chief of staff. This is Corey Lewandowski on child separation, as Jacob described it during the first Trump term.
I mean, look, I read today about a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome who was taken from her mother and put in a cage. I read about did you say want to a 10-year-old with Down syndrome being taken from her mother?
Pick anything you want up at the
Heading to the top of DHS.
So many things to say.
We got 2 hours, baby.
I mean, you know, I think for a lot of people, I know for those of us who love our dogs, that was it and, you know, it's interesting, of course, Donald Trump, the former president, future president, who has no use for dogs. Not surprised, maybe not a coincidence that he doesn't find that terribly off-putting in her selection. I think there's there's no doubt, the following things are all true, that the The mass deportation plan is this Trump 2.0's version of Build the Wall, and it's the highlights, the banner headline, long promised during the campaign for years. He's been talking about it. It's also the case that, unlike building the wall, the political risks entailed are much, much higher. A serious attempt to mass deport 20 million undocumented immigrants from this country would require the federal law enforcement, state law enforcement, local law enforcement to do nothing but that. And the first time something went wrong, which it would quite soon, where a kid got shot, somehow something, rounding up people and putting them in cages, putting them in trucks, trying to get them out of the country on that scale, the risks of a high-profile catastrophe, human catastrophe happening that would backlash against Donald Trump pretty quickly are very high. Also, the business community in America is not for this policy. This is a huge number of people who are, I say this cynically, but it's just a fact, who are cheap labor for American business. So there's a certain amount of deportation that the business community will tolerate. On a mass scale that Trump has talked about in certain cases, there would be a huge backlash from a lot of big American companies. Again, people that Donald Trump does, in fact, care about to some extent. There's a question in my mind about, so what is the scale of this going to be? And how much of it is going to be a Potemkin thing designed to look as though there are mass deportations happening when there are not, in fact, mass deportations happening. And I will say that among the many things that are both curious and extraordinarily disturbing about Donald Trump's relationship with Elon Musk, one of them is, in the same way that Twitter/X got turned into a propaganda, misinformation, disinformation machine for Trump in the campaign, I think we all have to be very careful and very vigilant in our business to make sure that that platform and associated other platforms aren't being used either to minimize or exaggerate the degree to which this policy is in fact being affected as we go forward. I can talk about this all day long.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think I have some friends in the midst who are students of this subject. One of whom I saw yesterday in Chicago, one named Jory Craig, who is brilliant and has been studying the right-wing information loops in a serious way for a couple decades. And her comment to me yesterday was, there's a way in which this could be done. Look out for the possibility that this will be done for show, that the social networks that want to amplify Trump's message will claim that it's taking place on a larger basis than it really is.
Like wag the dog.
Sorry?
Like wag the dog.
Yeah, a little bit in the way, yes. That was not the.
Joining me now is former Republican National Committee Communications Director and Republican strategist Doug Heye, and former Democratic Senator from Alabama, Doug Jones, the two Dougs, a distinguished senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Thank you very much, Senator, for being with us, and to Doug Heye. So National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, they're both powerful roles, obviously. What do we expect, from this new administration with them in top positions? And what do you think of these early picks, along with Homan as border czar and possibly Kristi Noem as the DHS secretary? What does all this say? Doug Jones, first to you.
Well, candidly, Andrea, the pick of Marco Rubio, I think, from my standpoint, is a little reassuring, even though I think that there was such conflict between Rubio and Trump in the early days of their relationship. I've known Senator Rubio. He has got great experience in the intelligence community and other things, and seems to be someone that I think Democrats can work with, and is something I think would be very good for this administration. I'm a little more concerned with Congressman Walz, an election denier, really just a Trump loyalist, and Kristi Noem, who has no experience with Homeland Security whatsoever. The border czar, Homan, is somewhat very disturbing, I think, for anyone who believes that the system ought to be actually fixed rather than simply a draconian round them up and throw them out, the way that Steve Miller seems to want to control the immigration system in this country.
And the president will be playing with, at least several more senators. But Doug Heye, there's some consternation we hear from Capitol Hill that with such a narrow majority, that he's now named 2 House Republicans from safe seats. Yeah. But it takes a while to elect, to hold special elections and to replace them. So they're reducing by 2 what could be, a majority in single numbers, single digits for sure.
If you're a Republican on Capitol Hill, it's a good problem to have, but it's a problem. And so as Donald Trump meets with House Republicans tomorrow, I'm sure they will be jocular about this, but House Republicans and House Republican leadership are going to make it clear, stop poaching from us. We need to help you here in the House chamber, not so much within the administration. And, part of the challenge is, so if you look at Elise Stefanik, her race would probably be safe. It would be competitive, but probably safe for Republicans. But the appointment that would happen in the meantime would potentially be a Democrat by a Democratic governor. So there are issues of concern there.
Well, apparently they talked to the Speaker, Mike Johnson, about all of this. Let's see what he had to say.
President Trump fully understands and appreciates the math here, and it's just a numbers game. We believe we're going to have a larger majority than we had last time. It's too early to handicap it, but we're optimistic about that. But every single vote will count. I think he and the administration are well in tune to that. I don't expect that we will have more members leaving, but I'll leave that up to him.
So right now, it's very narrow. It looks as though they will keep the majority. We can't call that yet. NBC has not called it yet. We want to count the votes, and California still has some that are still out there. But right now, they're fairly confident on Capitol Hill about keeping the majority.
They are. And look, obviously, we've seen the past, 2 years of House Republican rule. That's been a lot of choppy waters with the 15-vote speaker vote for Kevin McCarthy, the ouster and so forth. But having a president of your own party in the White House, that enforces discipline right there. There's going to be a whole lot less tolerance for rogue actors within the Republican conference to act up as they have over the past couple of years, because Donald Trump will tell them to stop it.
And Mike Johnson is expected to actually go to Mar-a-Lago this coming weekend. In the Senate side, Doug Jones, as a former senator, let's talk about what you're seeing there, because Schumer changed his mind and did invite Dave McCormick, the Republican who has claimed victory, but NBC has not declared it yet because there's still votes to be counted, provisional ballots to be counted in that Bob Casey versus Dave McCormick. That said, Schumer did, after saying he wasn't going to invite Dave McCormick today to the organizing meetings, he did. So he's kind of putting his finger a little bit on the scale there, that the assumption is that McCormick is ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that is the assumption. I mean, look, I think history will judge that, recounts very often, very few times will it change the outcome of what the initial count was going to be. And so I think it's just more realistic. He's not putting the scales one way or another, but I did think it's just realistic to go ahead and bring someone in. Bob Casey's already there. He knows the ropes, so he doesn't have to do that. One thing, Andrea, I want to mention with what Doug said about the House, because he's absolutely right about the numbers in safe districts. But I would also remind that this would be a special election. And, the Senate seat from Alabama was a safe Republican seat in 2017 when there was a special election. You really can't tell what's going to happen in these special elections. Democrats have had incredible success in special elections over the last 4 years. So it's really a roll of the dice, I believe.